So today we're going to be looking at chapter 8, and it's just titled Early Civilizations in Africa. And so we're going to hop around the world's second largest continent. And so just for a frame of reference, there are over 100 different spoken languages in this very large continent. And so it can be divided up into 3 basic geographic regions. But even still, we're going to be generalizing a very large portion of the world in a very large area of land in a very short amount of time. So I'll do the best I can. I want to begin with a question here, and just kind of going back to something that we began the course with. Of course, the way the course is structured, it's really neat that we hop around parts of the world and then look at how major revolutions like the discovery of farming have affected people in this part of the world. So that's what it means when the advent of farming, we're going back to that Neolithic revolution, but along with farming, pastoralism, which just means using domesticated animals. So how did those 2 major changes in human history affect various peoples in Africa? And so again, we're talking about a very large area that's very diverse, that for our purposes, I'm just going to break up into 3 parts. So that's the area north of the Sahara Desert, the world's largest desert, the desert itself, and then the area south of the Sahara. Because really, when we're talking about Africa, it's incredibly diverse. It's not just limited to desert and not. In fact, some of the longest and largest river systems go through the continent of Africa. Some of the largest plains, the savannas of Africa, or some of the largest of their kind. And of course, Africa has the dense jungle that is the Congo. And so it's an incredible place. But aside from Asia, Africa really is the largest landmass, roughly 5,000 miles from the Cape of Good Hope, which is the southern tip, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea in the north. And for example, from the west, say the furthest western point of the African continent is Cape Verde, and then on the farthest eastern portion is the Horn of Africa, and it's just called that because if you look at it on a map, which I'll pull up a map in a second, it looks like a horn. And so the earliest peoples here were hunter-gatherers, not unlike most of the other parts of the world that we've talked about. And really some of the earliest peoples, period, some of the earliest Homo sapiens migrated outward from parts of Africa. And so these folks were some of the very first to adopt farming. And so, that Neolithic revolution, that is, the New Stone Age discovery of farming, occurred at different times in different parts of the world. But these were some of the first, just because these were some of the first people. And so let's look at some of these early kingdoms. And, we've discussed Egypt, and you should be familiar with the Nile River Valley. But to the south of that, and the Nile, I always get it backwards, the lower Nile is the northern part where it fans out to the delta. The upper Nile is, or even upper Egypt, is the upper stretches of the Nile River. And so the southern part of Egypt is a land called Nubia. And it's a kingdom, I guess the earliest kingdom there was a group of people known as the Kush, and they were a major trading state. And by about the second millennium of the common, of before the Common Era, they declined and were eventually replaced by a state that emerged in an area known as the Cataracts. So even Africa's incredibly diverse. Even if we zoom in and look at the Nile River, it's incredibly diverse. The most populous region of the Nile is where it fans out into the delta. But the upper region is incredible. It's where the Nile comes out of the mountains, and there's this series of cataracts or rapids that are just miles and miles long. They've only been navigated a very seldom amount of times. So there's a famous traveler and explorer named Henry Coetzee who was determined to navigate the entire Nile River and actually passed away about a decade ago. He was eaten by crocodiles, or alligators, excuse me. So anyway, it's a fascinating part of the world. But when these earliest peoples declined, they were eventually replaced by a new state around this great bend of the Nile River. And their capital is the city of Meroe. And the main reason that people lived here in this area was, number one, obviously the Nile River, steady source of water, farming settlements, but also in the mountains there were abundant sources of iron ore. And so Meroe was a very powerful trading empire in itself. And it even had competitors. For example, a few hundred miles to the southeast, in what is today Ethiopia, the earliest peoples there were a kingdom called Aksum. And they claimed to be descended from the famous Queen of Sheba. And so she's mentioned in the Old Testament, and this is kind of their connection. So one fascinating thing about the Aksumites and later the Ethiopians was when much of North Africa, when I say north, I'm saying north of the Sahara, when much of North Africa converted to Islam, Ethiopia connected their history and their cultural roots and really remained predominantly a Christian nation. So anyway, they traced their descent all the way back to this famous African queen. Now, Aksum survived for centuries as this competitor to Meroe and owed much of their prosperity and their location was ideal because really when you look at Egypt and even parts of the Nile, it's a crossroads between three major continents, between Europe, Asia, and Africa. And so many people are traveling through this region, and of course they're passing through Aksum. And as they travel between India and the Mediterranean, and as ships are traveling along the coastline, they're regularly stopping at the main port of Aksum, a city called Agilis. Now, Aksum was famous for its exports of ivory, frankincense, myrrh, and of course those two being incredibly valuable spices, but also the slave trade. So Aksum made much of their wealth in the slave trade. And many of these slaves would come from conquest against their rival city-state of Meroe. And as they would conquer, they would take captives. And eventually they conquered Meroe entirely and created a vast empire. And so when we talked about Rome in chapter 5, and we talked about how once they ruled an area expanded around the Mediterranean, if you look at square mileage of land, the kingdom of Aksum really rivaled the Roman Empire. And so again, the distinction when we think of Ethiopia today or Aksum then was the fact that where Islam is going to be introduced, they're going to remain connected to particular forms of Christianity, mainly Coptic. Okay, so that's just a little brief overview of some of the peoples who live north of the Sahara. But now let's look at the world's largest desert. So Meroe and Aksum were part of this vast trading network, and it extended from the shores of the Mediterranean, so in the north, all the way to the Indian Ocean, which is the east coast of Africa. And while there were different patterns of trade, varying depending on the area, and also different patterns of life depending on the geography and climate. So we don't really know exactly when this type of international trade began to occur. We just know it happened a lot, and there was frequent commerce between the people of Aksum and the folks who lived around the Mediterranean, the folks who lived around India. They were even connected with the Silk Road. But then around the first millennia of before the Common Era, there was this commercial center that we talked about when we looked at Rome of Carthage. And of course, they had become a very important trading empire of the trans-Saharan trade network. So what that means is that even back to the earliest days of the Roman Republic, there were overland trade routes crossing the Sahara Desert. So for example, the Berbers were an ethnic group indigenous to western parts of North Africa. And they were often the travelers or the caravans that would bring goods across the desert. So now the Nok culture, which is really the earliest peoples who live in what is Nigeria today, eventually became one of the most active iron working societies in Africa. So I'll show you some of their work in just a little bit. Their work included not only clay, but also figures made from iron, but also works of stone, and even tools. So the Nok were really the first people north of the Sahara to begin using iron on a regular basis. But now, not all of the people involved in trade across the desert were nomadic. So that was really the service that the Berber people made their living on, is transporting goods across. And they were primarily nomadic. But not all peoples involved in this trade were. In fact, there's been some recent work done in the Libyan desert that revealed the existence of a kingdom that transported goods between societies all along the Mediterranean and even south of the Saharan desert. So for example, there's the Garamites. They brought salt, glass, metal, and even various oils, and then they would trade these for slaves and gold. And they had a settled community, and they used sophisticated irrigation systems even in this arid region to make use of this land that really experiences such a small amount of rainfall per year. So we don't know exactly why these settlements declined, but some believe that it's because of really the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was this powerful central government that also facilitated trade and also imported a lot of these goods that were being brought over land across the Sahara Desert. And so groups like the Garamites made their living off of Roman commerce. And so that may be one reason that trade dried up there. Okay, so now to look at East Africa. And I just thought this was neat. This is someone in traditional garb. And I believe they're part of the Kiwa tribe, but I'll come back to that in just a minute. Folks have been living in East Africa for about 5,000 years. That's when we really see the oldest farming settlements there. And the oldest languages spoke. Really throughout most of the African continent, the mother language is called Bantu. So Bantu is a family of languages that, again, there's over 100 spoken languages throughout the African continent, but many of them contain words or traces of this old mother language. And the Bantu peoples migrated out from their original homeland in Nigeria all throughout East Africa. And so they may have been the folks to have introduced farming and knowledge of iron and iron tools to the rest of the people in the region. So they were an incredibly important mother culture even. Okay, so I mispronounced it. It's a indigenous person from the Congo as part of the Kuba tribe. So. All right, so now here's the savannah, and I think this photograph's neat because you can see this area of the savannah that's bordering the Sahara Desert, but if you were to turn the camera the other way, you'd see vast grasslands, occasional bodies of water, and diverse wildlife. And so I just thought this was neat too. Another one of the, as we begin to move south of the Sahara, another one of the important trading centers was the great city of Zimbabwe. And so at its height, it rivaled most of the large cities in the world, and was an incredibly important center for trade. And so here's some of the famous pyramids from Meroe. So remember, Meroe and Aksum really served as rivals, but in their time they were incredibly wealthy and powerful. So, and these are the Knocks. So the Knocks are famous for their works with iron, though the sculpture you're seeing here is made out of clay, terracotta. Okay, so looking at ancient Africa, and for one, you can see the movement of peoples moving out, and you can also see, some of the earliest farming settlements. Notice they're scattered all throughout. But then even some of the major sources of iron, like over here, and basically everywhere there's a square.
What is the horn that you're talking about?
Yeah, the Horn of Africa. It's right here. So there's the Kingdom of Aksum, what is today Ethiopia. And yeah, if you look at it, it does kind of resemble the horn of a rhino. Okay, so now to zoom in just a little bit on Ethiopia and Nubia. So it's Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt. Again, I always get it backwards because Upper Egypt is south. But these are the cataracts. This is where the city of Meroe is, and the rival Aksum. All right, so moving into the next part, I want us to think about the impact of Islam on this part of the world. And so Africa is home to one of the largest Muslim populations in the world. And so this has affected everything from forms of government to society to commerce to the way people live even. And so first I want to look at how most people lived before Islam reached Africa. And I think it's fascinating because it gives us a chance to look at how many people lived before they were introduced to some of the more famous religions today. So a common default state for early peoples is a practice called animism. And it's not a formalized religion, it's just that early peoples have a way of personifying things that they don't understand. So if you look at and read ancient religious texts, then they often ascribe some type of personality or spiritual significance to the sun, or to the weather, or to death, or to any natural forces that were beyond their understanding. And so animism literally just means soul. And it's the concept that everything has a personality, that everything is controlled by personality. And now in Africa, there is this, many peoples often had this concept of the afterlife because, again, if death is something that's not understood, then there must be a spiritual significance, and then there must be a personality that affects this. But there's also this concept called pantheism, and this is the idea that all things are connected, and that all things come from a central deity. So another aspect of animism is, again, the mystery of death. What happens to ancestors? What happens to people who have come before us? And so if everything has a personality or a soul, then even the dead. And so a lot of ancient cultures have a means to communicate with these larger forces and a means to communicate with the dead. Now, Islam's going to change a lot of that. And so really, as Arabs begin to migrate into North Africa, and Islam's primarily introduced through trading routes, in addition, of course, we talked about Islam in more detail last week, but how Arab conquests are really going to expand these Muslim caliphates, but also just expanding the religion of Islam and their influence westward. Of course, with the exception of Aksum and then later Ethiopia. So this region's just always been fascinating. For one, of all the many places that were conquered by fascists and Nazis and the Soviets in the Second World War, Ethiopia resisted. And they resisted, of course, the Italians who were hoping to rebuild the Roman Empire. Now, the kingdom of Aksum, and then, of course, later Ethiopia, had a dominant presence in this trans-Saharan trade network. And while they were declining throughout the 6th century of the Common Era, the rise of Islam further complicated this process. So, most surrounding nations like Mali, Nigeria, Songhai are going to convert to Islam predominantly, with the exception again of Ethiopia. And so this is going to make trade difficult. This is going to make diplomacy difficult. And as their world is increasingly adopting a different culture, they're sticking to what they knew. Now, around the 12th century of the Common Era, relations between Aksum and their neighbors began to deteriorate. And really, Islam gained further control through most of the countries in North Africa. Most of the people were converting to Islam. And most of these countries began to dominate trade in ivory, in the slave trade, in gold, and so many other things that are really just going to drive the price of these commodities down, and it's going to decline the wealth and importance of Ethiopia. So, meanwhile, the response to this was really to further centralize the government and really to further double down on this distinction of Christianity versus Islam. And that distinction, that difference really served to unite many people and kind of define the culture and their identity. All right, so back over to East Africa. This impact of Islam just can't be understated. And again, with the exception of Ethiopia, most of East Africa is going to convert to Islam. And really, the Arabic term for East Africa was Zanj. And it was just a reference to the dark skin, or they called it the burnt skin, translated from Arabic, of the indigenous people living there. And according to tradition, around the 7th or 8th centuries, people from the Arabian Peninsula began to settle and live around ports and coastal areas, and this trade really generated a lot of revenue for this region. So the area that is the land of Zanj, or this East African coastline, today is one of the poorest areas in the world. It was once one of the wealthiest cities and most powerful trading empires. Most of the coastal states had their own form of self-governance, and sometimes towns and city-states would group together under single authorities, but really they had their own home rule. But a lot, and really even, I guess the height of this would be around the 12 or 1300s. But of course, a lot of this is going to change with colonization. So meanwhile, over to West Africa. So the expansion of Islam into West Africa had a major impact on the political system. So, for one, by introducing Arabic, um, which was the first written language in much of West Africa, uh, but as well, these Muslim states introduced many of their political practices, Sharia law, but also Islam provided these local rulers with the means to increase their authority. So, for example, Ghana emerged in the 600s around the upper Niger Valley, and the majority of people living there were farmers, living in villages, organized by local chieftains, really no form of central government. But gradually, these communities came together and formed the Kingdom of Ghana. Now, although the people of the region traditionally lived on farming, just like most people in the world pre-industrial revolution, a primary reason for Ghana's importance was gold. The heartland of the state was near one of the richest gold-producing areas in all of Africa. And so this made Ghana a very wealthy state. And they flourished for several hundred years. But by the 12th century, they were under constant attack. Now, they eventually collapsed, and a number of new trading groups emerged. Of these, perhaps the most prominent were the Kingdom of Mali. And Mali also built its wealth in the gold trade. And they were situated just south of the Sahara. This is where Nigeria is today. And really, these kings of Mali, in fact, there's a really famous story from a Muslim traveler who went to meet with Mansa Musa, the king of Mali, and he came back and he wrote a travel story of just the wealth that he saw there from this gold trade. So. All right, so this is Kiwa, and this is a mosque there, so you can see the influence of Islam. So the city of Kiwa is on an island just south of what is today Dar es Salaam, and it's a center of Muslim culture. It's along the coast of East Africa. So. Now, as we look at how Islam spread throughout East Africa, you can see it's affecting different regions, primarily along established trade routes. Uh-oh. Okay. So in the next section here, I wanted to look at what role did the movement of people play in the change of these societies, and really how did the impact of these movements compare to population movements elsewhere. And so we'll start with the southern half of Africa, so south of the Sahara. And things moved a little more slowly than they did in the north. For one, there's not going to be as much interaction between Europe and Asia south of the Sahara, just because there's fewer people traveling across that desert. So most people in this region lived in non-centralized societies. So that is either small city-states or clans or tribes, stateless societies, well into the 1200s. So these stateless societies are fascinating to study. You know, right here I'm showing you a herdsman of the Maasai tribe, a group that today continues to be a nomadic people. And they continue to practice many of the ancient elements of their culture. So for example, for a Maasai warrior to become a man, they would have to go out and kill a lion with a spear. And so there's a really cool movie called Ghost in the Darkness, based on a true story of two lions that nearly slaughtered an entire work crew that had been organized to build a railroad. And in desperation, the British company hired a group of Maasai warriors because they were famous for hunting lions with spears. And the two lions actually killed the warriors that went after them. But nonetheless, these people are famous as one of the modern stateless societies, kind of like the Sioux were in the late 1800s, as one of these modern groups that still moved and lived a nomadic lifestyle. So there's a lot that we can learn from these people. So for one, we get to learn about how ancient peoples organized by default along family groups. And these family groups were often ruled by a local chieftain, often the eldest male, but they also had close kinships with neighboring family groups. And they would work out their own systems for dealing with crime and punishment. Often vengeance was used as a form of justice, and so it was a deterrent for violence. But over time, these local clans and groups began to consolidate into larger nations. And I just think they're fascinating. So most of these people, of course, lived in this stateless society. For example, in the Congo River Valley, you could throw a seed in the ground and a few months later it's going to be a plant. I mean, it's an incredibly lush, fertile region. And so as a result, people had such an abundance of food that there was never a necessity to form any type of complex political structure. And so where we're going to see earlier developments of complex political structure are more harsh climates, places where either invasion was common, famine, or severe weather that are going to force people into more, I guess, more complicated or complex societies. So anyway, two states did emerge south of the Sahara, two of the earliest. The first, Luba, it's right in the center of South Africa. And it's centralized perfectly between lush farming areas and abundant sources of fishing along the source of Lake Kisal. And so the Kingdom of Congo is going to be one of the very first of these people to emerge. Now, that's not to say these people weren't wealthy, and that's not to say that none of them dwelt in community. Perhaps one of the largest cities in the world for its time was the great city of Zimbabwe. And so Zimbabwe is located in the grassland regions of the savanna of the Zambezi River. And there you see an economy mixed between agriculture, domesticated animals, but even commercial pursuits, trade, international trade between different countries. And so Zimbabwe has consisted of several different villages built within walled enclosures, particularly to protect animals, to keep them from wandering. So Zimbabwe lies in ruins today, and you can go and see it. And these ruins are known as the Great Zimbabwe. And even though no one lives there, you can go and see, and the video's showing you a few examples of this, of just how powerful and how populous this area was, and how important the trade with gold, farming, the domestication of animals, and this international trade really served to bring a lot of people together and generate a lot of wealth. But now, south of the Sahara, this mother language of Bantu is also present, as these people spread and migrated out for thousands of years. But as they migrated, they also encountered earlier people in the area, still live primarily by hunting and foraging. So the evidence suggests that these earliest relations between these people were initially harmonious. That the Bantu peoples meeting with these Neolithic early Homo sapiens really resulted in peaceful interactions, intermarriage, intermingling, and so this really resulted in a blending of the cultures. So that means that many native peoples indigenous to South Africa can trace their ancient ancestry back to both these groups. So one of the languages that I just thought was interesting and worth noting is a language known as Khoisan. And it's nothing like anything we've heard before. It's not Latin-based. It's not anything that we would recognize. It's a series of clicking sounds, and that's their method of communicating. So just an entirely unique group. But now, really, until about, I guess, post-World War II, most Western people really saw the African continent as a landmass without a history of their own. A land of scattered villages, isolated world events, a victim of colonization. But as further studies post-World War II have discovered, there's some sophisticated people. There's some powerful trading kingdoms. There's evidence of interaction with people of all parts of Africa with other parts of the world. Colonization is going to disrupt a lot of this. And the economies and people of this region are going to suffer from that, which we'll talk about in a later chapter. But what I really wanted to note with this chapter is there's sophistication, there's culture, there's a lot of people. And I just think that's fascinating. But it's a part of the story that hasn't gotten told really until the past 50, 60 years. All right, so the transition of these stateless societies to states, to nations. So this map just shows some of these earliest nations like Benin or Congo or Aksum, Mali, etc. So there were many different nation states that emerged. But the next question I want to ask is, what role did lineage groups or women or even slavery play in African societies? Because, these Portuguese slave traders didn't invent the system of slavery. It existed when they landed in places like Mali or Songhai or Congo. And they traded for slaves in existing markets. And so I wanted to look at that a bit, but also we're going to look at urban life, culture, village life, just some of the ways that people lived at this time. So now, generalizing, of course, is difficult because we're talking about a very extremely diverse continent. For reference, 1/4 of all the world's languages are spoken in Africa. So when I try to summarize, it's hard to do. But a few things we can note. For example, urban life. These towns began, in most cases, as walled city-states, much like what we talked about with Mesopotamia, or even really in any part of the world. These early city-states, farming villages, people grouping together for safety, and that's how most of these communities began. But then, just like Mesopotamia, eventually they organized into larger networks, and these larger networks serve various purposes. For one, they would be the center of government, the economic center, and places where many of the skilled workers and merchants and artisans would live. But then meanwhile, just like most parts of the world pre-industrial revolution, most people lived in rural areas and farms. And in these farms and rural areas, just like most people in the rest of the world, these villages were comprised often of single family groups. For example, I'm from a community that was founded by 4 family groups. It was a farming community for most of its history. And it doesn't date back that far, probably a little before the American Revolution. But the folks who lived there and were just very connected, but it was mostly a farming village, just like many of the rural areas here in Africa. So often comprised of single languages. So that's another aspect of common culture that unites people, particularly in stateless societies. For example, the Sioux were the largest nomadic group in the United States well into the end of the 1800s. And they were united into various clans and tribes, but then they were part of this larger nation because of their common language. And so, life in the village. Most Africans lived, really until the Industrial Revolution, lived in these small rural farming villages. And so, like Confucius talked about, the basic aspect of civilization is the family, and this can be evidenced by people living in stateless societies. So, the role of women. Now, women were typically seen as subordinate or second class to men in most African cultures, in most early societies. In some cases, they were valued for the work they could do or for their role in parenting and in increasing the size of the population of a village. But however, there is a difference. In many African societies, the family history was traced matrilineally instead of by the father. So, for example, I carry my father's name, who carried his grandfather's name. In many African societies, it's quite the opposite. So that's one distinction. But for the most part, Africa is a very patriarchal society, much like the other parts of the world we've looked at this time. But now the practice of slavery. While colonization is going to accelerate this and lead to the forced exportation of millions of people, particularly into the Western Hemisphere, the practice of slavery had been around since ancient times. And I don't have a distinct origin of when slavery began in Africa, or really when slavery began anywhere, but we can tell that it's particularly a phenomena associated with conquest or war. That if I can distinguish African slavery from chattel-based slavery in pre-Civil War United States, I think the biggest difference is that it's not racially based. Is that the practice of slavery in Africa was primarily based around conquest and war and capture, and that slavery was not a lifetime identity. It was not an inherited title. It was not a permanent status. And slavery in Africa often was temporary, that people could escape to a neighboring village, that it probably more closely resembled POWs than it did the institution of slavery that was recognized by the United States government until 1865. So slavery is different, but I don't want to say that Europeans invented it, because these existing markets. So slavery was very common, really in most of the world, and really until there's no like global discussion of abolition until around the 1700s. But you know, where did these slaves come from? Whether nomadic groups raided and captured people in villages or communities, and then they would often be brought to, particularly around the time when the Portuguese slave traders were transporting slaves across the Atlantic Ocean to these kingdoms on the west coast of Africa. But now, again, I don't want to discount the extreme severity or the inhumanity of the slave trade in Africa. So most slaves in Africa would work on plantations, just like in the southern United States. And this was a hard life. Perhaps the most fortunate would be pressed into service in the military. And even there, it might be possible for them to win their freedom. And there were also slaves working in people's homes, just like in the antebellum South. Now, in some societies in North Africa, slaves made up as much as 75% of the population. And so you'll see this in several places in the world. I think my favorite story there was the island of Haiti, where slaves vastly outnumbered whites and eventually overthrew the island of Haiti. But again, in most cases, the percentage of slaves is much lower. So, wanted to look at a traditional home in South Africa. I wish I could say this was a thing of the past, but that's actually a common sight if you travel through Africa today. So a little about culture. I thought this video was neat, so I just wanted to share it with you. And if we turned the sound on, you would hear a number of West African drums. You would hear shouting. You would hear. It's a very vocal performance, but I thought you could get the picture from looking at it. But a few questions here as we're getting toward the end of this chapter are just, what is it about the works of art that these people produce? What can we learn about the works of art, carvings, music, architecture, and I guess what purpose did this creative expression show in forming an identity? So we'll start with painting and sculpture. And I have to admit, I'm no art expert, so I'll do the best I can. But some of the oldest art in the world has been found in Africa. And some of these rock paintings or paintings in caves date back as far as 7,000 years ago. And so more recent paintings depict horse chariots and even the use of wagons to transport larger amounts of goods. Earlier paintings reveal the use of the camel and domesticated animals because they could travel across dry regions. And of course, wood carvings and sculptures were very common too. And so the traditional headdress you see here was just carved from trees, made from grass, and in this kind of pantheistic tradition, the artist would make a sacrifice to the spirit of a tree before making a carving of wood from it. And music. Now, for years, I know Davidson River School had a West African drums program, and I always thought that was really neat. But African music and dance, kind of like you saw in the previous clip, um, not only served a ceremonial function or an expressive function, but also a religious purpose. And traditional West African music can often be described with heavy rhythmic beat, dancing, but even how this expression was a form of communicating with the spirits. And I think it's neat to think about, how a lot of these cultures came with African slaves to the New World, and how a lot of traditional African American music had a heavy influence on popular music today. So that old kind of heavy rhythmic beat and even dancing that goes way back. So variety of instruments. If you're thinking traditional West African music, drums are probably the most common instrument you would hear, but also bells, horns, wind instruments. Now, another important feature of African music is the use of voice. So not just voice in terms of lyrics, but voice in terms of, again, if we went back and turned the sound on, you'd hear what I'm talking about. So in terms of architecture, some of the oldest architectural structures that are found in Africa are pyramids. But I thought this was neat. I wanted to show you one of the pillars of Aksum, this kingdom of Ethiopia, and really even the kingdom of Meroe adopted this pyramidal form. And I think the pyramid structure is fascinating just because when we talk about these early peoples and we talk about how so many people ascribe a spiritual significance and a personality to natural elements, then the sun is going to be the most prominent. And in most of these ancient societies, the sun is the predominant spiritual being. And so it just stands to reason that people are going to build religious structures that are tall in an attempt to get close to the sun. And so this was also common in Africa. But then we have these stone pillars that I just think are fascinating. These are called, I can't pronounce it, S-T-A-L-A-E, so stele. All right, and so we're almost done. Just wanted to show you a bit of this.
Voices from the past. African civilizations. Griots, the storytellers of West Africa.
The griots of West Africa were a lot like reporters today. Centuries before the West Africans wrote their history in books, they relied on griots to tell their stories. Griots, who were usually older men, memorized their village's history as well as the history of every family in the village. They passed these stories down from one generation to the next. In fact, there are griots today who can recite their village's history over the past 2,000 years. Like reporters, griots witnessed the deeds of others. They even marched to battle beside the warriors from their village, but to watch them, not to fight with them. Still, the griots' presence inspired the warriors to fight harder. After all, they knew that the griot would tell the whole village whether they had been courageous or not. It was kind of like being exposed on the evening news. Griots were also entertainers. They sometimes told folk tales that explained mysteries, like how the world was made. In the following tale, for example, a griot tells why West African nations and tribes were constantly at war. The tale is called The Peacemakers. Before humans walked our land, the animals lived in peace with each other. One day, the leaders of the lion, the elephant, and the boar kingdoms met at a watering hole to find a way to make sure that peace would endure. Let's tell each other what we dislike, so we don't offend each other accidentally, said the Lion King. If we set a good example, our subjects will be sure to follow. Most wise, agreed the Elephant King. I, for one, do not like to be talked about behind my back. Being talked about doesn't bother me, put in the Lion King, but I absolutely hate it when someone approaches me without respect.
What makes my blood boil?
Neither of those things bothers me,
said the Boar King.
What makes my blood boil is when someone steps on my tail.
Having aired their pet peeves, the rulers repeated their vow to be peacemakers, and then the elephant lumbered away.
I wonder.
As they watched him go, the boar asked the lion,
behind his back.
I wonder what the elephant thinks is said about him behind his back.
Probably how clumsy he looks carrying all that weight, smiled the lion. And they both had a good laugh.
He stormed back.
But the elephant's big ears overheard their conversation, and he stormed back.
What do you mean by that insult?
He thundered, waving his trunk in the lion's face.
And what do you mean, approaching me with such disrespect?
The lion roared. They began fighting. The boar looked on, saddened by what he saw. Then, in the heat of their battle, the elephant stepped on the boar's tail. The boar screamed and soon was fighting as fiercely as the others. When the other lions, elephants, and boars heard the noise, they ran to the watering hole. Seeing their leaders engaged in combat, they turned on each other and have been fighting ever since. And I'm afraid that when the tribes of humanity began to walk the earth, we unfortunately learned from their example.
So I just thought that was cool and wanted to share it. So by way of closing, I want to show you just a few more artifacts here. So this is entirely made from iron. And of course, this predates European exploration by hundreds of years. It just shows the technical excellence and sophistication here. All right, so here's a few things we covered today, and everything from the earliest hominids coming into Africa all the way through to, we'll get to more about the European exploration, colonization. But how a lot of this we just didn't know until historians and researchers began to dig a bit deeper, particularly after the Civil War, or after the Second World War, excuse me. But I believe that's all I got for now. So yeah, I'll hang out for a few minutes if I can help you guys with anything.